Module 2 starts on the afternoon of day 1 with initial instance configuration. The content in this module will be very familiar, and hopefully it's a bit of an autopilot for you. The content's been around for several releases. The activities and labs include several of our tried and true labs. Initial instance configuration, I've slimmed that one down a little bit so that we've got less repeat stuff between ServiceNow Fundamentals and this. We have our LDAP authentication and data population lab. No real changes to that. Lab 203 and 204 are a pick one type of experience, or for those gung-ho people who work incredibly fast, they can do both. The SSO integration lab, as you all know, is a bit of a beast, but we also have a much simpler multi-factor authentication lab that students can do. It's like a 15-minute thing, but it gives you a good warm fuzzy if you're less technical and can't handle the SSO integration lab. It's also just pretty cool. When we get to labs 205 and 206, again here we give students a choice. For those who are going to be working heavily within CMDB, we've got our tried and true lab that's been around for ages at this point to load CMDB data and establish relationships. And then we've also got the import foundation data that we introduced in the Kingston release, where we've got a few different challenges, but we look at importing users, group membership, group roles, etc. So there are a few different lessons in that. I would encourage students to pick one to do during class, but then try the other one on their own time later on. When we look at the sections, we begin with basic instance settings. I know that you guys don't care for this, but it is important foundational information. So we begin with ITSM guided setup. In here, this is where we have platform branding, email setup, LDAP, and single sign-on. So this kind of sets the context and the flow that we have in this module. It's all in ITSM guided setup, frankly, because no other product group wanted to own this. And the ITSM group already had it in there. So that's the only reason that it's in ITSM, but it is core platform configuration. We begin here with company configuration, system configuration, and the welcome page. I have seriously slimmed down what we do in the lab related to this. People can read, there's a lot of documentation about that. We go into email as well, following along the guided setup. Email properties, I know that the majority of customers just go with the standard configuration using ServiceNow as their email provider. Just be aware that there are options here. Also, hit on the basic properties. We've got this on the next page. These are things that need to be set for all new implementation projects for new customers. Make sure to put on the email trap for non-production instance testing in all your subprods, and then also set the email user label. I think in the lab we have them set that to cloud dimensions. So email doesn't work in student instances, but I've kind of rigged it to where we can set some of the properties here. Lab 201 includes 3 stories that I've kind of touched on here: company system configurations, accounts for the core administration team. It's a little bit of an overlap with foundations, but pretty important. And then configure email accounts and settings. That's new. You'll also notice on the lab queue slides that I've got the time estimate for how long this sprint should last, as well as the page number where the lab starts. So hopefully, I know several of you were adding in the page numbers as kind of a post launch thing. I've done that work for you. We next get into LDAP, and again here, total autopilot as we go through this. The one big difference here as we look at LDAP integration capabilities is our reference to orchestration. In the London release, was it London? Maybe Kingston. We introduced a spoke to integrate with Microsoft Active Directory or Azure AD to do some orchestration level activities there. So I've replaced the orchestration reference with a reference to Integration Hub and that spoke in particular. Look at the life cycle, that's the same. LDAP OU configuration, same thing. In the demo here, we are using the guided setup UI. In the lab, we use the UI, kind of the more advanced UI that's available in the menu. We did that on purpose. First time you set up, you could probably do that fully with guided setup. But if you are technical resources going in to maintain or modify something for a customer, you're going to use the other interface instead. So it's important to know about both and kind of get that sense. Okay, that brings us to our LDAP authentication and data population lab exercise where we've got configure it and then show the authentication details on the user form. We go into SSO. Nothing really has changed here. It's all the same information. The select IDP though, I tried to hit on that in the previous TTT, but I want to do that again here. This box indicates the levels of information that ServiceNow checks to figure out which single sign-on provider to use to authenticate Joe employee here. It'll first look in his browser, do we have a cookie set? If no, then we look back in ServiceNow. Is there a primary identity provider set for the instance? If no, then we look at the user's record. Does Joe have anything filled out in his SSO field on his user record? If so, that'll identify the identity provider. No? All right. What company is Joe associated with? Is there an SSO identity provider field value there? No? Okay. Finally, is there a default one? We'll go there. So it's kind of like we go through this list on down the line until we find a match, and then we know which identity provider to use to authenticate Joe. Okay. Very, very important that we understand that and get that right. I do have multi-factor authentication in here. It's just so simple and easy. We talk about what multi-factor authentication is. We've got a screenshot. And then again here, we get to choose which of these optional labs we want to do for students. Both of them are optional, so keep an eye on the clock. If you want to leave this to homework, if you're running behind, feel free to do so. Otherwise, have students choose one or the other. I will say SSO probably is about 40 minutes. Enable multi-factor authentication. If you don't have a lot of time, that's like a 15-minute deal. So you can recover some class time with that. Finally, we get to foundation data and CMDB. We talk about what foundation data is, and again here we're walking through guided setup. So on the left we can see when ServiceNow says foundation data, these are the things that we're talking about: departments, locations, companies, users, etc. That's foundation data. In the past we've called it core data, lots of different terminology, but since they've used foundation data in guided setup, that's what we're going with. And then finally we get to CMDB in guided setup. Stress the importance of reviewing your data before you import it. Look at the general import process. This is all the same as we had before. Import process for CI and relationships. And then we get to Sprint 4, where we pick one or the other to complete. There's nothing special in the student instance configuration, so either of these is appropriate to do in a personal developer instance as well. There's slightly different lessons in each of those, but it kind of depends on what students will be concentrating on when they go back to their organization after class as to which one might appeal to them. Then we finally get into the initial instance configuration module recap. And here for furthering your learning, you could say, hey, complete the guided setup sections in a developer instance, complete the importing data into ServiceNow course in the developer portal. And then I've also got a tiny URL to a knowledge base article where we've identified several public LDAP directory servers that students can test their integration capabilities, see if they can integrate with another LDAP directory server. So that's Module 2.